But Alan Greenspan was not your stereotypical economist.
He was also very charming and a man about Washington.
He played jazz clarinet, had made himself rich on Wall Street, and he had embraced an unusual political guru,
challenging the moral code of altruism.
the libertarian philosopher Ayn Rand.
Everybody is enslaved to everybody.
Greenspan is a disciple. She is the great champion of government as a destructive force that just gets in the way.
Mike Wallace, Ayn Rand, 225-1.
Practice it all my life.
Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy?
I am opposed to all forms of control. I am for an absolute, laissez-faire, free, unregulated economy. Let me put it briefly. I am for the separation of state and economics.
Greenspan talked about Rand in his autobiography.
Ayn Rand became a stabilizing force in my life. It hadn't taken long for us to have a meeting of the minds, mostly my mind meeting hers.
Rand stood in the Oval Office as her star pupil was sworn in.
Greenspan had a very clear ideology about regulation.
His philosophy was in the form of what we called libertarianism. And that meant those who do well prosper, those who do poorly fail, and the market clears the transactions.
But I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
It was a philosophy made to order for Ronald Reagan.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
In 1987, Reagan made Greenspan the most powerful banker in the world, the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Greenspan was a believer in Ayn Rand, a believer in free market. A little bit curious for a central banker, because what is central banking? It's a massive intervention in the market, setting interest rates.
Greenspan worried about this contradiction in his autobiography.
I knew I would have to pledge to uphold not only the Constitution, but also the laws of the land, many of which I thought were wrong.
Now the Vice President will swear Alan Greenspan in as the
He swore the oath and took the job.
I had long since decided to engage in efforts to advance free market capitalism as an insider, rather than as a critical pamphleteer.
He understood that there were laws he had to enforce that he personally would not have passed, but he intended to do as little as he could on regulation, and he proceeded to do just that.
And by the time Bill Clinton took the White House, the anti-government rhetoric had become so fashionable that even some Democrats embraced it.
Ronald Reagan had won. Government was seen as the problem, and even though Bill Clinton was someone who believed in government and wanted to use it, he was kind of forced into that Reagan-esque ideology because that was what people wanted to hear.
From the beginning, Clinton aimed to reassure powerful forces on Wall Street, and he did so with a key appointment.
I asked Robert Rubin to serve as assistant to the president for economic policy.
Rubin is the best-known financier in the country at that point because he had run the legendary Goldman Sachs.
Bob Rubin was Bill Clinton's emissary to Wall Street. Clinton placed great trust in Bob Rubin and Bob Rubin's view of financial markets and financial regulation.
He had an enormous amount of credibility because he was a business success, and Democratic administrations always seem to worship people who can excel at business.
At the White House, and as Treasury Secretary, Rubin found an unlikely ally. Clinton had asked Alan Greenspan to stay on.
Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan were very much in lockstep. They had very similar views on Wall Street. It boiled down to the less regulation, the better.
And Rubin populated the Clinton administration with a network of free market true believers.
It wasn't just Rubin and Greenspan who were these free market acolytes. That thinking pervaded the Treasury and the White House.
Among Rubin's acolytes, 35-year-old Timothy Geithner, and Rubin's top deputy, the outspoken Harvard economist Larry Summers.
Summers is tough. Summers is very blunt-spoken, doesn't suffer fools lightly or anyone else, as the saying goes.
Bob Rubin is not a guy who likes confrontation. He's confrontation averse. But he understands you need someone in there who can swing a heavy axe. And that person was Larry Summers. He was the enforcer.
Together, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers formed their own pro-business, anti-regulation support group.
They're the committee to save the world, according to the Time magazine cover. These are the people we turn to at that moment, who together, all three in a way, say, trust us.
They seem to have things under control. You know, the world trusted Rubin and Greenspan, so why wouldn't Clinton? You know, and the market was doing great, and the country seemed to be doing great.
He's joining the party on Wall Street today, posting a triple-digit gain along with it.
5 times its offering.
9 for total 41,000.
Extremely active volume, 55 million shares changing hands, and market rent is
2,500 dots.
These were the euphoric, go-go 90s.
Well, you know, the mid to the late 1990s were a very ripe boom period. It was the most robust portion of the tech boom.
Internet fever has not subsided.
On the money tonight, internet fever again.
Up 700%.
The financial markets were zooming.
Priceline.com is the latest beneficiary of the internet stock craze.
The market was rocking and rolling.
Shares of the web technology companies soared more than 450%.
Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 91 points today.
$300 a share.
Santa Claus arrives early on Wall Street.
But in Washington, there was one agency that looked at the bull market with some skepticism. Buried deep in the bureaucracy, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, CFTC.
It was a small fish in a otherwise a pretty big pond. It was always viewed as kind of a sleeping, small, not terribly significant agency.
The agency was authorized to regulate agriculture futures and to oversee arcane, complex financial instruments known as derivatives.
No, they're one of these little afterthought agencies that kind of get in the way of the big guys.
The CFTC started getting in the way in 1996, when a new chairperson, Brooksley Bourne, took over.
My law practice was in the derivatives area. I practiced derivatives law for more than 20 years.
Brooksley Bourne is a long-time securities lawyer. She has a stellar reputation. She's been around the block. She knows her stuff.
Bourne was 55, a veteran of the gender wars that had influenced many women of her age group. In Bourne's case, the struggle had started early. Bourne went to Stanford in the early 1960s. Most women in her class got married. Brooksley went to law school.
There were very few women in law school at the time. This was during the Vietnam War. And a lot of men in the class saying, what are you doing here? You're taking the place of somebody, a man who could be here and not have to go to the war. The way she approached this was, well, I got to show him I can do it.
She did, top of her class. The first female president of the Stanford Law Review.
You would think this would be a great moment of triumph for Brooksley Bourne. Instead, she gets a phone call from one of the deans, and he says, Brooksley, I just want to let you know that the faculty stands ready to step in if you're not able to pull this off. It goes on like that, on and on and on at each step of Brooksley Bourne's life and career.
In Washington, she became a partner in a prestigious law firm, built an international reputation, alliances with other powerful female attorneys, including one who happened to be the wife of Arkansas's governor.
She had developed a very close relationship with Hillary Clinton when Hillary Clinton was a very prominent lawyer in Little Rock, Arkansas.
And then Bill Clinton won the presidency.
Brooksley Bourne found herself being invited down to Arkansas during the transition for a meeting with him to discuss possibly being the Attorney General of the United States.
She's very self-effacing. You know, she's flattered, but she's going to see if it happens.
Week 7 of the Clinton transition. NBC's Andrea Mitchell tonight.
For Attorney General, Clinton is considering Washington lawyer Brooksley Bourne, but he may have...
Brooksley went in for an interview with Clinton. The story that comes back was that Clinton found her boring and that it never went anywhere.
It didn't happen. Janet Reno was chosen.
And that's how Brooksley Bourne ended up running the obscure CFTC.
I think to some extent you could view this as a consolation prize. To the general world, people who knew Brooksley, the circles she traveled, the American Bar Association, the D.C. Bar, all the prestigious boards she served on, people were probably scratching their heads.
An experienced financial litigator who'd seen the worst of the markets, Bourne was a believer in government regulation. Given the political climate in Washington at the time, clashes with Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers were inevitable. Almost right away, she had one. It began after she received an invitation to lunch at the Federal Reserve with the chairman himself.
How could you not have a little bit of butterflies in your stomach when you're going to go see Alan Greenspan at that moment in time?
It didn't take long for Bourne to learn that she and the chairman were not going to see eye to eye.
He said something to the effect of, well, Brooksley, we're never going to agree on fraud. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you probably think there should be rules against it. She said, well, yes, I do. He said, you know, I think the market will figure it out and take care of the fraudsters.
The Alan Greenspan lunch, did it actually happen? Where he says...
I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it on camera.
Bourne is reluctant to speak about her meetings with Greenspan or others in the Clinton administration. Greenspan refused to speak to Frontline at all, but Bourne's advisors did.
Greenspan didn't believe that fraud was something that needed to be enforced, and he assumed she probably did. And of course she did. I've never met a financial regulator who didn't feel that fraud was part of their mission.
And this is an absolute stunner for the new head of this tiny agency, who is charged with making sure people don't commit fraud.